Every flight carries its own story, but some stories are written in ways no passenger could ever predict. What appeared to be a simple clash of attitudes soon twisted into something far darker, each small act of cruelty building toward a revelation powerful enough to silence an entire cabin. What began as humiliation turned into exposure, and what seemed like arrogance collapsed under the weight of truth. The final moments of this journey left no one untouched, and the lesson it carried could not be ignored. Stay with me through this story, and remember to like, subscribe, and share in the comments how the plot struck you and where in the world you are watching from. Dorothea Langston was a 72-year-old black woman whose elegance had been shaped by a lifetime of dignity and resilience. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, her deep-set eyes carried the weight of experience, and her presence commanded a quiet respect that words could not. She dressed without extravagance, just a dark sweater and a light scarf. But every detail was clean, precise, and deliberate. To the casual eye, she looked like any other elderly passenger boarding a plane, moving carefully and deliberately down the narrow aisle. But there was something unshakable in her posture. Her silence carried strength, and her steady gaze could force arrogance to bend beneath the truth it tried to deny. The boarding gate had been filled with a familiar chorus of rolling suitcases, impatient sighs, and the muffled sound of announcements that blended into background noise for most frequent travelers. Dorothea had arrived early, as she always did, her ticket clutched carefully in her hand, a sign not of uncertainty, but of a lifetime habit of being prepared. Her gray hair was neatly arranged, her long wool coat buttoned with precision, and though she moved at a measured pace, her posture reflected strength. She had always believed that moving through the world with dignity, no matter who watched, was both a responsibility and a quiet form of resilience. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the scent of recycled air mixed with the faint tang of jet fuel greeted her, familiar and unwelcome, but she paid it little mind. Her focus was on the journey ahead, not the minor discomforts. When she entered the narrow cabin, her eyes quickly adjusted to the tight rows of seats, the overhead bins yawning open, the muffled chatter of passengers already seated. At that moment, she encountered Brielle Huxley, the flight attendant stationed at the front. Brielle's uniform was immaculate, her blonde hair tied in a severe knot, her smile absent. Her expression shifted the moment Dorothea appeared, the kind of subtle change that does not require words to wound. Her eyes slid from Dorothea's hair to her coat to her shoes, carrying with them an appraisal that dripped with silent judgment. Without speaking, Brielle raised her hand and pointed toward the rear of the plane, the gesture curt, dismissive, and laced with disdain. Dorothea hesitated. She was certain her ticket confirmed a seat near the front, but Brielle's frown suggested she was expected to obey without question. The authority in her stance was enough to make passengers hesitate, and Dorothea, not wishing to create a scene, tightened her grip on her handbag and slowly moved forward, confusion already prickling beneath her calm surface. As she passed the first few rows, she adjusted her coat, smoothing its folds as she had always done when moving through unfamiliar spaces. It was then that Brielle, striding forward with practiced efficiency, brushed against her shoulder sharply, the impact forceful enough to cause her to stumble slightly, one hand bracing against the armrest of an aisle seat. The contact was no accident. Brielle did not slow down, did not glance back, did not acknowledge what she had done. Instead, her heels clicked firmly against the cabin floor as though she were marking territory, leaving Dorothea in her wake. The small act went unnoticed by most, but to Dorothea it was a deliberate statement. She was not welcome, not respected, not regarded as deserving of the same courtesy shown to others. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Dorothea straightened her coat again, took a breath, and walked further down the aisle, determined not to let the sting of the moment unravel her calm. Yet something in the back of her mind whispered that this flight, this crew, would not treat her as just another passenger. For Brielle, the performance had only begun, and she had already set the stage with contempt. To Dorothea, who had seen enough of the world to recognize quiet cruelty when it appeared, this encounter felt less like an accident and more like a warning. And though she kept her silence, her eyes flicked briefly toward the flight attendant's back, memorizing every detail. as though already preparing for what might come. Dorothea, ever determined to follow what she knew to be correct, stepped into the row listed on her pass, placed her handbag neatly beneath the seat, and reached for the small suitcase she carried with practiced strength. Her fingers curled around the handle, her shoulders steady as she prepared to lift it into the bin above, an action she had done countless times before on many flights across the years. Yet this time was different, for standing just a few steps away, Brielle paused to watch, her eyes narrowing slightly, lips pressing into a thin line as though she were anticipating something less than graceful. Dorothea bent her knees and raised the bag, the weight pulling against her arms, but her movement was firm and controlled. She was close, the suitcase only inches from sliding into place, when Brielle's hand moved suddenly, not to help, not to guide, but with a careless flick that shifted the bin door just as Dorothea tried to set the bag inside. The bag slipped from her grip, fell heavily to the floor, and the dull thud turned heads briefly before passengers returned to their own distractions. Dorothea froze for a moment, heat rising in her chest, not from exertion, but from the sting of humiliation. She leaned down, smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt, and steadied herself as she picked the bag up again, her movements slower this time, more measured, because she refused to let the moment unravel her composure. Brielle remained unmoved, her posture rigid, her expression neutral, but the faintest hint of satisfaction lingered in her eyes. The silence of her refusal to help spoke louder than any words could have, and the sight of Dorothea forced to repeat the task alone was a cruel tableau designed to diminish. As Dorothea tried again, pressing her strength into the lift, the suitcase finally slid into place, though not without the ache of effort radiating through her arms. She pressed the bin closed firmly, checked the latch twice, and turned to sit down. She told herself that the action was complete, that she would not allow the subtle sabotage to define her journey, yet she could not deny the deep awareness that the act had been intentional. Only seconds later, the same Brielle moved quickly to assist another passenger, a younger white man struggling with a bag of similar size. Brielle stepped in before he could even try, smiling, lifting the suitcase smoothly into the bin and adjusting it so the compartment closed without difficulty. The contrast was undeniable, and Dorothea felt the weight of it pressing into her chest. She was not offered help when she needed it, yet help was given readily to someone else, and not just help, but kindness. Dorothea looked down at her hands, folded them gently in her lap, and inhaled, letting the breath out slowly as though exhaling the insult before it could poison her spirit. Around her, the chatter of passengers carried on as though nothing had happened, but she knew that these small humiliations, when stitched together, created a fabric of cruelty stronger than a single act of open aggression. Brielle moved further down the aisle, smiling faintly as she assisted others, her earlier coldness toward Dorothea now hidden beneath layers of routine professionalism. To anyone watching casually, she looked like any other attentive attendant, but to Dorothea, the difference in treatment was unmistakable, carved into memory like a wound that does not bleed yet still aches. She glanced out the window, her reflection staring back at her, dignified but weary, and thought of the many times in her life when contempt was served not through shouting or obvious insult, but through these quiet denials of basic respect. She adjusted her scarf, straightened her posture, and reminded herself that resilience was not in pretending these things did not happen, but in enduring them without losing one's sense of worth. The plane filled more quickly now, the seats occupied row by row, and the hum of settling passengers grew louder. Dorothea kept her silence, but inside, she catalogued each detail, knowing this was not the end. Brielle's small cruelties had begun with contempt, and now they had evolved into humiliation carefully staged to appear invisible to most. She was accustomed to waiting, to letting the world move impatiently around her while she held her ground with calm resolve, but the air felt heavier now, and each moment seemed elongated by the presence of Brielle, who lingered near the front of the cabin with a poised stance and a glance that cut sharper than words. Dorothea noticed the curtain that separated the forward section from the rear was still open, swaying gently with the air that flowed through the cabin. As she moved a step through, Brielle advanced suddenly, her arms sweeping upward, pulling the curtain closed with an audible snap of the fabric against the rail. The gesture was not one of routine, but of exclusion, sealing Dorothea on the wrong side, while passengers already seated watched her hesitation with detached curiosity. The line of travelers behind her pressed forward, forcing her to step aside as though she had intruded into a space where she was not welcome. She stood there, the curtain brushing lightly against her sleeve, the quiet message clear. She was to wait while others were allowed through, as if her presence required containment, as if she did not belong in the same rhythm as the rest. Minutes passed, though each second stretched longer in the silence that wrapped around her. Brielle busied herself with trivial adjustments, rearranging safety pamphlets and smoothing her skirt, never once acknowledging Dorothea's weight. Finally, when a stream of passengers thinned and the aisle grew clear, Dorothea eased the curtain aside herself and moved to her assigned row, her chin lifted, her movement slow and steady as though she carried an invisible weight of expectation. She lowered herself into the seat, placed her handbag beneath the chair in front of her with meticulous care, and drew in a long breath, letting the air out slowly as she looked toward the window. The view of the tarmac was distant and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth she had tried to preserve within herself. She told herself this was nothing new, that she had endured similar acts of exclusion before, but the setting made it more cutting. In the confined space of the airplane, the humiliation was magnified, contained like a whisper that could not escape. Brielle moved down the aisle soon after, arms filled with pillows and folded blankets, distributing them one by one with brisk efficiency. She leaned into rows, offering a quiet smile or nod. Her gestures softened for some passengers, as though she carried an endless supply of courtesy. Dorothea watched silently, her hands folded in her lap, waiting her turn with the patience of someone who had long practiced restraint. When Brielle reached her row, her arm still carrying a few remaining items, she glanced briefly at Dorothea, then lifted her hand to shut the overhead compartment above with a sharp push, the thud echoing slightly. Without pause, she pivoted, handing a pillow to a woman 2 rows behind and offering a blanket to a man on the opposite side. Dorothea remained empty-handed, left only with the sound of the compartment closing above her, a sound that spoke louder than words, telling her she was undeserving of the same comfort given freely to others. The disparity was so precise it was undeniable, an action performed deliberately yet masked under the guise of efficiency. To the casual eye it may have looked like routine, but to Dorothea, who had been on the receiving end of such choices throughout her life, it was a pattern she recognized instantly. Exclusion often arrived disguised as procedure, but it always carried the same sting. Dorothea adjusted her scarf and lifted her gaze forward, refusing to bow under the pressure of invisibility. The small cruelties were accumulating layer upon layer, and she could feel the structure of humiliation building around her, brick by brick. Yet even as Brielle walked away, leaving behind the cold echo of denial, Dorothea's spirit remained anchored. She knew that endurance was not weakness, that patience was not submission, and that observation was a weapon as sharp as any confrontation. Dorothea Langston remained still, her back pressed firmly against the seat, her handbag tucked carefully beneath her feet, her hands resting in her lap with the composure of someone who had already endured too much to let minor discomforts break her poise. She replayed the earlier slights in her mind, the intentional misdirection to the back of the plane, the brush of Brielle's shoulder that nearly toppled her, the humiliation with the bag, the curtain pulled closed, the denial of a pillow and blanket. And though her face revealed nothing, her thoughts were sharpened to a fine edge. She understood patterns, she understood escalation, and she knew that when contempt began to grow bold, it often found new ways to express itself in front of others. The signal to begin service came soon after takeoff, the chime ringing softly as the attendants prepared their carts. Brielle positioned herself with the confidence of someone who believed the cabin was her stage, the rows of passengers her audience. Her smile returned as she poured drinks and handed them to passengers with light nods, her voice carrying the tone of courtesy she had withheld from Dorothea. Row by row, the small comforts were distributed. Sodas fizzed into plastic cups, napkins folded neatly on tray tables, and a warmth of interaction passed easily to those around her. When the cart reached Dorothea's row, Brielle's demeanor shifted with the subtlest precision, a flicker of disdain in her eyes that most would miss. She held the cup of water carelessly, tilting it as she set it onto Dorothea's tray, the motion too abrupt to be an accident. The water spilled quickly, splashing onto Dorothea's skirt, darkening the fabric with spreading blotches. The chill of the liquid soaked through the cloth, and Dorothea inhaled sharply, not from surprise but from the cold that pressed against her legs. Brielle, without pause, drew a napkin from a stack, not to offer, but to pat her own hands, moving slowly as though drying a precious surface. Her gaze did not meet Dorothea's. Instead, she shifted her eyes forward to the next passenger, the gesture of self-care a deliberate denial of the assistance Dorothea clearly needed. The nearby travelers glanced momentarily at the scene, but most looked away quickly, unwilling to challenge the hierarchy of authority that made the older woman's discomfort invisible. Dorothea pressed her palm gently against her skirt, attempting to blot the moisture with the corner of the napkin that had been placed beneath her cup. Her movements were quiet, composed, and though the sting of humiliation burned hotter than the water was cold, she refused to let it pull her into visible despair. The cart moved forward again, Brielle's steps brisk, her hands deft as she resumed her courteous act for the next row. Yet as she pulled the heavy cart along, her aim became careless once more, and the metal edge of the cart struck Dorothea's knee with a sharp thud, the pain blooming instantly through the fragile joint. Dorothea's hands gripped the armrest, her jaw tightening as she steadied herself, the ache radiating upward into her thigh. Brielle kept moving, her stride unbroken, her face turned deliberately away as if she had not noticed. The force of the impact had been calculated, not so strong as to cause injury that could be pointed to, but strong enough to cause pain, strong enough to send another message of disregard. Dorothea remained still, letting the wave of pain pass, her eyes lowering to her lap where the water stain had already begun to dry. She did not call out, did not demand recognition, because she knew such appeals would be dismissed or twisted. Instead, she breathed deeply, a steady rhythm that brought her back into herself, her strength quietly asserting itself in silence. Around her, the passengers continued sipping their drinks, their voices carrying fragments of conversations about weather, business trips, and vacations, as though nothing had happened. To them, the scene was invisible, another unnoticed act in the endless churn of anonymous travel. But to Dorothea, the sequence of humiliations was no longer subtle. It had become overt, public, and undeniable. She understood that cruelty delivered in public, especially when unchallenged, was meant to erode not only dignity, but also the perception of equality itself. By allowing the spill, by striking her knee, Brielle had attempted to stage Dorothea as less than others, to turn her into a silent prop in her own display of authority. Dorothea's eyes narrowed slightly, the first visible shift in her composure since the journey began. She adjusted the edge of her scarf with deliberate calm, repositioned herself in the seat, and sat taller than before. She knew that this story was still being written, and though Brielle had seized the role of aggressor, Dorothea's silence was not surrender. It was endurance, and endurance had its own quiet power. The low drone of the engines filled the cabin with a steady vibration, a rhythm that might have lulled others into rest, but kept Dorothea Langston painfully aware of the hours behind her and the indignities that had already accumulated like weights upon her chest. She sat upright, her shoulders squared, her scarf carefully in place, her composure a mask that concealed the deeper sting of humiliation. The water stain on her skirt, now dried into a faint ring, remained as a silent reminder of the cruelty that had spilled into her lap. Her knee still ached from the deliberate strike of the service cart, a wound invisible to others, but etched into her body with each pulse of pain. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had spent decades enduring the world's prejudices, a black woman who had learned early that silence often became both armor and prison. Brielle Huxley moved through the rows with her usual poise, her blonde bun tight, her uniform immaculate, her expression painted in the language of professionalism. To those who saw her smile at other passengers, she was the image of courtesy, but to Dorothea, She was the embodiment of a cruelty sharpened by bias. Cruelty that hid behind routine, yet revealed itself in every deliberate act of dismissal. Dorothea had seen those looks before, on buses that refused her seat, in stores where clerks followed her closely, in offices where her voice was dismissed before she even finished her sentence. That same look now followed her down the aisle of an airplane, years later, in a supposedly modern age, a reminder that skin color still shaped perception no matter the setting. When Brielle slipped into the galley, she opened the crew log with an ease that spoke of habit. She flipped to a blank page, pulled her pen from her pocket, and began to write, her strokes swift, confident, and without hesitation. On the page, she created a portrait of Dorothea that bore no resemblance to truth. She claimed the elderly passenger had been disruptive, that she had raised her voice at crew members, that she had complained incessantly, that her behavior needed careful monitoring. Each word was a distortion, a fabrication spun from nothing but bias. Yet on paper, with the weight of a uniform behind it, the lie took the shape of official record. For Dorothea, the injustice was not yet visible, but she could feel the shift in the air. She noticed how one or two passengers glanced her way with sidelong suspicion, their eyes measuring her not by her actions, but by the subtle signals of authority that had already cast her as guilty. It was the oldest trick in the book of discrimination, to plant a seed of doubt and let silence water it. One of Brielle's colleagues, a younger attendant named Callum, caught sight of a log entry when she left the book on the counter. His brows furrowed, his lips parted as if to ask a question. He had walked past Dorothea many times during the flight and had seen her sitting quietly, not a raised word, not a gesture of aggression, only the quiet poise of someone carrying herself with grace. But when he looked to Brielle for explanation, she returned only a faint, knowing shake of her head and a tight smile. It was the kind of gesture loaded with meaning, one that said, "You wouldn't understand, but trust me, she's trouble." It was the kind of coded dismissal Dorothea had lived with her entire life. The insinuations whispered when people believed their prejudice would not be challenged. Callum hesitated, his conscience pressing against the authority of a logbook, and in that hesitation silence took root, a silence that allowed the lie to spread unchecked. Dorothea shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes moving across the cabin with the wisdom of someone who had survived decades of such injustice. She remembered the first time she had been called loud for defending herself in a classroom, the first time a store clerk accused her of stealing simply because she had paused too long in an aisle, the first time her dignity had been diminished, not because of her actions, but because of the color of her skin. She recognized the pattern now unfolding around her. False accusations were more dangerous than spilled water or bruised knees. They lingered. They became permanent. They were harder to fight because they came cloaked in authority, shielded by uniforms and logbooks and procedures that the world trusted without question. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, her fingers steady, but inside she felt the tightening of the trap. She knew how easily stories like this grew. A note in a logbook could turn into a reprimand into a file, and a file into a narrative of misconduct. She thought of countless other Black travelers whose stories had been twisted this way, erased of truth, recorded only in the words of those who held pens and power. She turned her gaze toward the window, the golden light of sunset spilling across the clouds, and reminded herself that truth may be fragile, but it was never powerless. Lies built on arrogance always cracked, and when they did, the evidence of cruelty stood exposed. Dorothea folded her hands more tightly, whispering in her mind the lesson she had carried since youth. Patience is a shield. Memory is a sword. She would not let this accusation sink into silence. Every detail had been etched into her memory already, and soon it would be etched into record by her own hand, not by those who twisted truth. For now, she sat still, her composure intact, her dignity unbroken, her silence sharpened into resolve. Brielle might have thought she had secured her narrative, but Dorothea knew better. She had lived too long and seen too much to believe lies could outlast justice. Dorothea Langston sat motionless in her seat, her scarf adjusted, her skirt still bearing faint traces of water from the earlier spill, her knee aching with each slight movement from the blow of the service cart. She carried herself with the same dignity she had maintained since boarding, but inside, her mind traced every incident with clarity, storing them like carefully pressed flowers between the pages of memory, each preserved detail a testimony to the cruelty she endured. Brielle Huxley moved down the aisle with the confidence of someone who believed she commanded the narrative of the cabin, her actions orchestrated to appear efficient, courteous, and orderly to the majority of passengers, while weaving subtle threads of degradation around Dorothea alone. When the meal service began, trays clattered against carts, the smell of reheated chicken and vegetables filling the pressurized air, and the attendants moved with brisk coordination to deliver food to the seated rows. Brielle's cart stopped at Dorothea's row, her hands moving with precision as she distributed trays to the surrounding passengers, each receiving neatly sealed meals, their plastic wrappings intact, their presentation identical. Then she turned to Dorothea, lifting a tray that was different, one whose wrapping had already been torn, the seal broken. The container shifted slightly as though it had been handled before. Without a word, she placed it before Dorothea, the tray landing with a dull thud against the plastic table. The implication was silent yet deafening. Here, take what is left, take what is secondhand, take what is not worthy of others. Dorothea looked at the tray, her hands resting motionless on either side of it, her gaze calm, but her mind alert. She did not lift the utensils, did not peel back the lid, did not give Brielle the satisfaction of watching her accept this insult. Instead, she let the tray sit untouched, a quiet refusal cloaked in composure, her eyes shifting to the window where clouds drifted like silent witnesses. Brielle continued forward, her posture unbroken, as if her mission was complete, her cruelty disguised beneath the motions of duty. Dorothea's stomach tightened with hunger, but her resolve was stronger than the ache. She would not consume what had been offered in contempt, for she knew that accepting such a meal was more than accepting food. It was accepting the role Brielle had written for her. Time passed slowly. The cabin dimmed as the crew adjusted the lights for passengers to rest. Dorothea shifted slightly in her seat, her muscles stiff from hours of stillness, her knee still tender. She waited until the aisle cleared, until the attendants busied themselves with other tasks, and then she rose, steadying herself with one hand on the armrest. Her intention simple: to stretch her legs, to ease the stiffness that came with age, to reclaim some small measure of comfort. She stepped carefully into the aisle, her movements calm and deliberate, her gaze steady as she prepared to take a few slow steps. But Brielle appeared suddenly, her timing precise, moving down the aisle as though summoned by Dorothea's attempt at relief. Her shoulders swung slightly outward, her body angling just enough to collide with Dorothea's, the impact not harsh but forceful, a maneuver designed not to wound but to control. Dorothea stumbled back, her hands gripping the armrest once more, her body pressed back into the seat she had just left. The message was sharp, undeniable, and humiliating. Remain seated, remain contained, remain silent. Brielle moved on without pause, her stride continuing as though she had merely brushed past an obstacle, her head held high, her authority unquestioned by those who had not seen the deliberate force in her action. Dorothea sat still, her breath steady, her dignity unbroken, but her mind etched another mark into the growing record. These were no longer subtle slights or passing humiliations. These were deliberate acts of psychological cruelty, designed to isolate, to diminish, to strip away humanity piece by piece. The broken meal, the forced retreat, the denial of movement, each action stacked upon the last, forming a tower of injustice built carefully by Brielle's hand. Yet Dorothea did not crumble beneath the weight. She straightened her scarf once more, lifted her chin slightly higher, and folded her hands in her lap, her silence not one of defeat but of endurance. She understood now, with complete clarity, that this was no longer about mere inconvenience or casual unkindness. This was a test of resilience, a battle fought without raised voices or open confrontation, a battle in which she had chosen her weapon long ago, patience sharpened into strength, memory honed into evidence, and dignity carried like a shield that no cruelty could pierce. She watched Brielle continue her work, distributing kindness and courtesy to others, her facade intact, her authority undisputed in the eyes of the many. But Dorothea knew that facades cracked under the weight of truth, and arrogance always stumbled when it believed itself invincible. The cabin had quieted into the uneasy stillness that follows a meal service, the smell of reheated food lingering in the recycled air, the lights dimmed to soften the edges of the cramped rows, and the faint drone of engines steady against the silence. Dorothea Langston sat as she had for hours, her posture straight, her hands folded, her expression calm. Yet beneath that calm lived the sharp memory of every humiliation she had endured since boarding. She thought of the false gesture that sent her toward the back, the deliberate brush of a shoulder that nearly toppled her, the humiliation with her luggage, the curtain closing her off, the denial of comfort, the spilled water, the strike of the cart, the false accusation entered into the crew log, the unsealed meal set before her like scraps, and the forced retreat when she had dared to stand. Each moment was carved into her memory with precision, each insult catalogued in the silence of her thoughts. Dorothea had spent her life understanding cruelty, but she had also spent her life preparing for truth. And as she sat in that dim cabin, she understood the moment had arrived when endurance alone was no longer enough. She reached down slowly, her hand steady as it slid beneath the seat to draw out her handbag. The leather was worn, the edges softened by years of use, but its contents remained guarded with the same care she guarded her dignity. She placed it gently on her lap, unbuckled the clasp, and drew out a notebook bound in leather darkened with age. She laid it open across the tray table, her movements deliberate, unhurried, revealing pages lined with meticulous notes and carefully kept documents, each stamped with the unmistakable insignia of federal aviation authorities. The seals, red and blue against the faded paper, glimmered faintly under the overhead light. A passenger seated across the aisle glanced toward the notebook and inhaled sharply, the sound piercing the quiet around them. The gasp was not born of idle curiosity, but of recognition, a realization that the quiet woman who had sat in silence all this time was more than she appeared. Dorothea did not look up, did not acknowledge the gasp, but she knew the weight of eyes was shifting, curiosity blooming in corners where there had only been indifference. She turned a page, her pen sliding into her hand, and began to write slowly, her script steady, her entries detailed. She documented each act, each slight, each humiliation with the precision of someone who knew every word mattered, who knew memory was not enough without record. She noted the spilled water, the cart to the knee, the false log entry, the denial of comfort. Her pen did not tremble, her wrist did not falter, for she had long prepared to bear witness in ink. After several minutes, Dorothea lifted her chin and closed the notebook gently, tucking it back into her bag. She rose from her seat with measured grace, one hand steadying herself on the armrest, and stepped into the aisle. The motion was small, almost ordinary, yet it carried with it a shift in the air. She began to walk forward, her steps unhurried, her scarf falling neatly against her shoulders, her presence suddenly larger than the confines of her row. As she moved, a faint glimmer caught the corner of several eyes, a small silver badge pinned discreetly to her sweater, hidden until now beneath the fold of fabric. The badge was simple yet unmistakable, its emblem engraved with precision, a symbol that belonged only to inspectors charged with oversight of aviation conduct. Some passengers straightened in their seats, their gazes following her, murmurs rising like ripples through still water. Recognition spread slowly, and the atmosphere shifted. The certainty of her quiet endurance, reframed in the light of authority, revealed. Brielle Huxley, who had been at the front of the cabin arranging service items, turned and caught sight of Dorothea approaching. For the first time, her poise faltered, her eyes narrowing as if she could not quite control the flicker of unease. The badge, the notebook, the steady steps of the woman she had tried to humiliate. Each piece converged into a revelation that cracked the mask of her authority. Dorothea continued forward, her expression unchanged, her dignity intact, her silence now transformed into power. She did not raise her voice, she did not confront, but her very presence carried weight, the badge glimmering softly as proof of identity, her stride as deliberate as the pen strokes she had just written. Passengers leaned toward one another, whispering, piecing together what they had witnessed all along, now seen in new light. The woman who had been treated with contempt was not powerless. She was not invisible. She was not without recourse. Dorothea Langston's small silver badge and the sight of her leather notebook had already stirred whispers among passengers, their earlier glances of pity or dismissal now reshaped into awe and curiosity. The woman who had been the quiet target of contempt was no ordinary passenger, and Brielle Huxley, who had moved through the cabin with the arrogance of unchecked authority, now found herself the object of hushed stares. Dorothea returned to her seat without hurry, her handbag placed on her lap, her presence calm but unshakably firm. She unfastened the clasp once more and drew out a sealed envelope, its ivory paper thick, its embossing sharp, the seal of the Federal Aviation Civil Rights Division pressed into the waxy surface with unmistakable authority. She set it squarely on the tray table before her, not hidden but visible, not flaunted but undeniable, a document that carried more weight than words could. The murmurs nearby quieted as passengers watched, realizing this envelope was not the possession of an ordinary traveler, but of someone who carried oversight and power far beyond the uniform of any flight attendant. Dorothea opened the envelope with careful hands, sliding free a set of forms, crisp and official, each page marked with letterhead that bore the federal crest. She placed them neatly beside her notebook, then lifted her pen once again, her hand steady as she began to record, line by line, the chronology of what had transpired since boarding. She documented the dismissal at the gate, the shoulder that shoved her off balance, the staged humiliation with the luggage, the curtain pulled close to isolate her, the denial of comfort, the spill of water, the blow of the cart, the false log entry, the unsealed meal, and the forced retreat when she had attempted to stand. Each entry was written with the precision of someone who had borne witness not only in memory, but now in permanent record. She did not write quickly. She wrote with care, every letter clear, every description exact, as though she understood that this document might one day be placed in the hands of those who judged not just individuals, but entire systems. A passenger seated nearby leaned slightly closer, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the federal crest. His mouth parted as though to speak, but closed again, his silence born of respect. Another across the aisle whispered to his companion, their voices low, their eyes darting between Dorothea and Brielle with growing recognition of the imbalance of power that had just begun to shift. Brielle, who had turned moments earlier to glance toward the front, stiffened as she noticed the envelope on Dorothea's tray. The recognition was instant, the change in her posture subtle, but undeniable. Her shoulders tensed, her smile faltered, and the rhythm of her steps lost their confidence. For the first time since boarding began, Brielle no longer looked untouchable. She moved quickly toward the galley, her hands brushing against trays and handles, her motions restless. The lead attendant, a woman named Marissa Duval, emerged from behind the curtain, her presence carrying the authority of seniority. She followed Brielle's glance toward Dorothea and froze, her eyes falling upon the embossed envelope, the visible documents, the badge that still glimmered faintly against Dorothea's sweater. Marissa's face shifted instantly, the professionalism in her features tightening into a mix of unease and calculation. She approached with careful steps, her eyes never leaving the envelope, her voice not raised but her presence demanding. Dorothea did not move, did not lift her gaze, but the act of continuing to write in the presence of the lead attendant was its own declaration. She was not intimidated, she was not deterred, she was carrying out her duty, and the documentation of Brielle's actions was no longer invisible. Marissa lingered beside Dorothea's row for a moment, her eyes scanning the crest and the papers, then turned sharply toward Brielle, gesturing with a firm motion. Passengers caught the flick of her wrist, the way her mouth tightened, the way her eyes signaled a shift in authority. Brielle hesitated, her face pale beneath the neat layers of makeup, but Marissa's look brooked no refusal. She stepped back toward the rear of the cabin, following Marissa's lead, her movements less steady than before. The whispers rose once more, passengers nudging each other, some leaning into the aisle to catch sight of what was unfolding. Dorothea remained still, her pen scratching against paper, her posture calm but commanding, her silence louder than any confrontation. She had not raised her voice, she had not accused openly, she had not broken composure, but the presence of that envelope and the act of writing in its shadow had dismantled the illusion of Brielle's untouchable authority. The curtain was pulled closed at the back of the cabin, and though voices could not be heard clearly, passengers could see the silhouette of Marissa speaking firmly, her hands gesturing sharply, Brielle's head bowed slightly, her figure less rigid than before. His tall frame, clad in the crisp navy uniform adorned with the insignia of command, carried the kind of authority that silenced a cabin without a single word. Conversations died mid-sentence, headphones were pulled from ears, and all eyes turned toward him as he walked with deliberate steps down the narrow passage, his gaze fixed on the curtained galley where Marissa and Brielle stood. The presence of the captain outside the cockpit was rare enough to draw immediate attention, but his expression confirmed to every passenger that this was not a social inspection. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp, his demeanor one of solemnity, and as he reached the rear galley, he pulled the curtain open with a firm hand. The sight of Brielle, her face pale and lips pressed tightly together, was revealed to all. Marissa stood beside her, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture aligned with the captain's authority. Dorothea Langston, seated calmly with her envelope now tucked away, lifted her gaze without lifting her chin, her eyes meeting the captain's for a fraction of a second. He acknowledged her not with a nod, but with the smallest flicker of recognition, the kind that passed between those who understood the gravity of silent evidence. He turned back to Brielle, his voice low yet strong enough to carry through the hush of the cabin, and though his exact words were drowned in the hum of the engines, his tone alone conveyed rebuke and demand. Brielle shifted uncomfortably, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped in front of her as though trying to appear smaller, her earlier confidence eroded by the weight of scrutiny. The captain gestured toward the cart counter in the galley where forms were kept, and Marissa immediately complied, retrieving a document pad and a pen. The passengers whispered now, their murmurs weaving together in a chorus of speculation, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding only a few feet away. The captain pointed toward Brielle, then to the forms, and began dictating details while Marissa wrote with efficiency, each stroke of the pen another piece of record that would travel far beyond the walls of the aircraft. The document was an incident report, not a casual note, but a formal acknowledgement of misconduct, one that would be submitted to the airline and potentially to higher authorities. Brielle's face flushed as Marissa turned the pad toward her, the pen pressed into her hand. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly, the silence of the cabin pressing in on her as dozens of passengers watched. She looked once toward Dorothea, who remained still, her presence unyielding, her dignity radiating from her silence. The look was not confrontational but steady, a reminder that Brielle's actions had been witnessed, recorded, and could no longer be dismissed. The captain's stance hardened, his hand gesturing firmly toward the page, leaving no room for resistance. With no option left, Brielle lowered the pen and scrawled her name across the acknowledgement line, her signature a reluctant surrender inked into permanence. The sound of the pen scratching against paper was faint but final, the symbolic collapse of the arrogance she had paraded since the moment Dorothea boarded. Marissa tore the sheet from the pad, handing one copy to the captain while tucking another into the log to ensure duplication. The captain folded his copy, slid it into his pocket, and fixed Brielle with a final stern look before turning to walk back toward the cockpit. His departure was just as silent as his arrival, but the power of his presence lingered behind him, leaving the passengers awed by the rarity of what they had just seen, a captain stepping from command to enforce justice in the open air of the cabin. Brielle stood stiffly, her face betraying the effort to maintain composure, her shoulders squared but trembling slightly under the weight of exposure. Marissa dismissed her with a small wave of the hand, and Brielle retreated down the aisle, the stares of passengers cutting into her with every step. Dorothea followed her with her eyes but said nothing, her silence more powerful than any words. The cabin slowly filled with hushed murmurs again, passengers leaning toward one another, recounting the sequence of humiliations they had seen and now reassessing them in light of Dorothea's revealed authority. Each small cruelty that once seemed invisible now loomed large in collective memory, reframed by the knowledge that they had witnessed not just rudeness but discrimination, that their silence had been complicity, and that justice was now unfolding before them. Dorothea folded her hands in her lap again, her scarf smoothed across her shoulders, her breathing steady. She had not demanded attention. She had not raised her voice. She had not even sought confrontation. She had simply endured, recorded, and revealed at the moment when truth outweighed arrogance. The plane began its slow descent through the thick layer of clouds, the city below coming into view, with lights twinkling against the late evening sky, the skyline rising in the distance like a quiet promise of conclusion. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady, instructing passengers to fasten their seat belts and prepare for landing, his tone carrying none of the strain that had gripped the cabin earlier. Yet beneath his professional cadence, there lingered an unmistakable undertone of gravity, for this flight was no longer routine, and the passengers knew it. They had witnessed a confrontation unlike anything most of them had ever seen, and the silence that had followed Brielle's reluctant signature on the incident report still hung in the air like an echo. Dorothea Langston remained seated, her scarf smoothed neatly across her lap, her handbag secure at her feet, her expression unchanged from the calm composure she had carried since the first moment of humiliation hours earlier. The hum of the engine softened as the wheels touched the tarmac with a firm jolt, the cabin bouncing slightly as gasps of relief and anticipation rippled through the rows. But this arrival was different from all others, for waiting on the ground was not just the usual staff of the airport, but a team whose presence would turn what had begun as cruelty into accountability. The plane taxied slowly to its gate, the bright tunnel of the jet bridge already extended, the glow of fluorescent light seeping into the windows. Passengers began to unbuckle their belts, the rustle of coats and bags filling the narrow aisles. But before anyone could stand, the chime of the intercom returned and the captain's voice spoke with unmistakable authority. He instructed all passengers to remain seated until further notice, his words sharp yet controlled, leaving no room for argument. A hush spread once more, curiosity rising like heat from the cabin floor. Then, before the door opened to the bridge, figures in dark uniforms stepped aboard, their badges gleaming under the cabin lights, their presence immediately commanding. A federal oversight team, their expressions resolute, moved down the aisle with precision, their eyes scanning, their steps steady. Passengers straightened in their seats, some whispering, some lifting phones to record discreetly, sensing the gravity of what they were about to witness. The lead officer approached Marissa, who handed over the incident report with careful hands, her eyes avoiding Brielle's. The officer scanned the document briefly, his expression hardening as he glanced at the trembling figure of the attendant who had once moved through the cabin with unchecked arrogance. Brielle stood rigid near the galley, her lips pale, her posture tense, her eyes darting nervously as the officers turned toward her. The lead officer spoke in a voice low enough not to echo, but firm enough to be heard by all nearby. He indicated that she was to come with them, and though his words were professional, their finality was absolute. Brielle hesitated, her body frozen as though clinging to a fading authority. But there was no curtain to hide behind, no uniform strong enough to shield her from accountability. The officers stepped closer, and the murmur of passengers swelled, their phones rising higher to capture the scene. With no choice left, Brielle moved forward, her shoulders slumped, her once confident stride broken into halting steps. The officers flanked her, guiding her down the aisle toward the exit. And in that moment, every passenger bore witness to the fall of arrogance. The very path she had once dominated became the path of her removal, her authority dismantled in the same space where she had sought to humiliate another. Dorothea sat still as the procession passed, her eyes following quietly, her hands resting gently on the closed leather notebook in her lap. She did not smile, she did not gloat, she did not rise to deliver a triumphant word. Instead, she waited until the officers and Brielle had exited the plane, the heavy silence broken only by the faint sounds of recording devices capturing history. Only then did she stand, her movement unhurried, her figure rising with the same grace she had carried since the beginning. She lifted her handbag from beneath the seat, adjusted her scarf, and closed her notebook with a soft snap that echoed louder than applause in the silence that followed. She stepped into the aisle, her presence commanding without demand, her message spoken not through voice, but through the quiet certainty of her actions. Passengers leaned aside to let her pass, their eyes filled with recognition, some offering nods of respect, others lowering their phones as if ashamed they had once been complicit in silence. Dorothea walked steadily toward the front, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, her composure unshaken, and in her silence she left behind a message no words could improve. For those who had seen arrogance play its hand and collapse under the weight of justice, the lesson was clear. Cruelty may thrive in shadows, but it cannot endure in light. Dorothea paused briefly at the exit, her gaze sweeping once more across the cabin, her eyes meeting those of strangers who would carry the memory of this flight with them long after they disembarked. She left without a speech, without a raised hand, without a demand, because her presence had already spoken. Arrogance may speak loudly, but justice always has the final say, and her silence was its echo. The end. If you followed this story to the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did the twists take you by surprise? Was the ending as meaningful as you hoped it would be? Let me know down in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how far these stories reach. And if you want more stories that shine a light on injustice and resilience, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. A simple like on this video also helps bring it in front of more people who care about truth, dignity, and the fight for justice.